Good evening and welcome to the TNT Show. TNT, as you know, stands for The Nation Talks. And tonight, The Nation talks to a very, very interesting interviewee. I really ask you, in fact, I plead with you, to please put aside a full hour for as long as the show lasts to listen to our guest tonight. I can tell you in advance, his name is Malik Al Nasir. But that doesn't quite convey his heritage, which is Guyanese, and also the strong influence that Liverpool had on his upbringing and the way he was treated. I want to start off with a question, if I may, which will give you some insight into why we should be very interested in what Malik has to say tonight. The question is this: knowing that Britain abolished slavery in 1807, it also agreed at that time to pay compensation not to the slaves, but to the slave owners. So my question for you tonight, I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about it and I'll tell you the answer because we've got a packed programme. When do you think the British government, the Treasury, stopped paying compensation to the slave owners? No need for answers on a postcard. I'm going to tell you the answer. The answer, and many of you are not really going to believe this, but it's true. The answer is 2015. That's right. 1807, 2015. And during all of that time, a whole bunch of British people were being handsomely compensated for the fact that they no longer had slaves. It's the most extraordinary thing, but it's the least extraordinary thing, I suspect, you will learn tonight. Stay with us, because it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest tonight, Malik Al Nasir. Malik, how are you? And thank you for joining us.
Hi. Good evening, John. It's really great to be back here with Independence Live again. It's been a while, but I'm really looking forward to chewing the fat with you guys this afternoon. So if everyone can hang tight for an hour, I'll try not to put you all to sleep.
Hopefully, no, you're not going to put anyone to sleep, Malik, because the story you have to tell.
To keep you guys going, you know.
Yeah, it's so compelling. Now let's begin. There's a fairly common view amongst most Scots that slavery was very much an English thing. It was all about Westminster. It was about rather nasty English people exploiting people with a different skin colour in a different part of the world. But most folks in Scotland are fairly comfortable thinking about it in those terms. Is that accurate?
Well, no, that is a popular misconception. And another thing, I just wanted to make a small errata on your introduction. Slavery was abolished in two stages, really, by Acts of Parliament. So as you rightfully mentioned, 1807. In 1807, they abolished what was called the slave trade, which was going to Africa and enslaving new people and bringing them across to the Americas, Caribbean, and so on. So that was abolished in 1807, and the British put up a flotilla of ships, of military ships, to create a blockade, and they would board your ship, and if you had enslaved people, they would take the cargo, so-called, and they would do what they did with the cargo. I mean, that's a whole nother story in terms of what they did with the enslaved people that they captured, but they were supposed to be liberating them, and they would maybe seize and destroy the ships of the people who were trafficking people. So that was 1807. So people think that that's abolition. That didn't stop abolition. That didn't make abolition occur in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean and the colonies continued to own the enslaved people until the Emancipation Act of 1833. And it was that Act of 1833 that also enacted provisions to pay compensation to the enslavers for the loss of their slaves. So it wasn't actually 1807 when the compensation started to run. They did look for compensation in 1807. Parliament didn't grant it, but they looked for it in 1833 and it was granted. And as you mentioned, then the compensation ran from then until 2015.
Thanks for this correction, but it doesn't subtract too much from the utter evilness of the whole process. The fact that the gap between the compensation starting and the compensation ending is
well, if
slightly
I may defer your first question, I could address that issue because it's quite interesting for Scottish.
Please do that.
Viewers.
So who are these Scots who are benefiting from?
There's two principal protagonists in making that Slavery Compensation Act operational, and they were both Scots. So
who are they?
One was Sir John Gladstone, MP, father of Prime Minister William Gladstone. So he was a Scot. And the other was Evan Bailey. And Bailey was a Bristolian who was also an enslaver and also an MP who sat in Parliament. And in 1807, when that act that we mentioned before was passed, people were asking for compensation then, and they didn't get it. So the whole thing about compensation had mumbled on a few times. There'd been insurrections and rebellions and requests for compensations and denials since the 1700s. And every time there was an uprising and people lost property, they sought compensation, didn't get it. Sometimes they got a loan, but generally they didn't get the compensation. So the conversation had been going on. But William Wilberforce and Thomas Fowle Buxton, two abolitionists, prominent abolitionists, had been campaigning for what Buxton referred to as a large and liberal atonement, which was to be given by Parliament to the enslaved population upon their emancipation, so that they could be compensated for having been enslaved. Okay, so Wilberforce called for this. Buxton, when Wilberforce got old and he was a bit ill, Buxton was the one who carried that message forward, and they were on their way to getting that over the line. Initially, the talk was about £15 million. Some people said it was going to be a loan and the enslaved would have to pay it back. There was a lot of different discussions about what that should look like. But the principal idea was for the enslaved to receive some compensation. It was all backed up with other stuff like they need to be quote unquote civilized, they need to be Christianized, they need to be a whole bunch of stuff. But there was money involved for them from the exchequer. Now, John Gladstone, who at the time was one of the biggest plantation owners in one of the biggest enslavers in Britain, and he had plantations in Jamaica and in Demerara, and I think he had upwards of 4,000 enslaved people on his plantations. And he was really the main mover and shaker, because he was at one point chair of the West India Committee, which was the main lobby group for the West India planters. And what he did was he was blamed in 1823 when there was an uprising of enslaved people on one of his plantations, which started what was known as the Demerara Uprising. It was the biggest uprising of enslaved people in British colonial history. And there was literally thousands of enslaved people joined in on this. And the whites were completely overwhelmed. And they, retreated. Many of them were captured, put in the stocks. Some of them were whipped. A couple of them were killed. Gladstone was blamed, hands down. The person who led the uprising was a guy called Black Jack Gladstone, which they said was an enslaved man, the son of a guy called Kwamina, who was enslaved. Personally, I don't believe that he was Kwamina's son. I believe he was the son of one of the Gladstone clan, but they didn't want to own him, so they didn't want to own up to him, if you like. They owned him, but they didn't want to own up to him. So they basically said, I think they told Kwamina that he should declare himself to be the father. So that to clean the sort of Gladstone slate, as it were. And I'll tell you for why that was important. When the uprising happened, it was just after Canning had passed a series of amelioration measures in a bill in Parliament. And the amelioration measures were a sort of a compensatory measure for like not doing emancipation. We're not going to free the slaves. What we'll do is we'll make it slightly less bad for them. Okay. So we'll establish a few little things like the protector of slaves. So an enslaved person could come and bring a case to the protector of slaves. Previously, they would go to the fiscal, and 99.9% of the time, the fiscal would rule in the favor of the planter, you know, as the white person. So the enslaved would have no recourse to justice. So now they had the protector of slaves established, and there was a couple of other provisions that they would be allowed time off, you know, on a Sunday or something like this. There was very minimal things, but the planters opposed it, and they were late in implementing it. And Gladstone said that this was what caused them to uprise, because they were so infantile and confused that they thought the king had freed them, and that the planters wouldn't let them go, and that's why they rose up. But there were conditions on Gladstone's plantation where people were being worked to death, to the point where he had, I mean, in one plantation, it was like 70 fatalities in a year. And these were young, strong, healthy men, but they're working 20 hours a day in tropical heat, doing hard physical labor in barefoot with poisonous snakes, and, you know, walking on barefoot on this chaff from this, you know, chopping this sugar cane. So these guys were just dropping like flies. And
wasn't there also a problem, Malik, with the poor souls who were consigned to processing the sugar? Because apparently
that was another side of it, the processing. That he didn't have a processing plant on his plantation, so there was the processing plants were on. There were certain plantations like Diamond.
Explain to people why the processing was so horrendous.
Well, the processing was horrendous because, like, they used to have to boil the sugar in these vats and so on, and it was just the physicality of the whole thing, and the processing noxious fumes. If you got the stuff on you, it would rip your skin off, and there's a whole range of things. But let me just finish with the Gladstone bit, if I may. So why Gladstone and Bailey was significant and important in this was that he'd been blamed for the 1823 uprising. He, in turn, blamed Canning and his amelioration measures. If Canning hadn't confused the Negroes, they wouldn't have rose up. That's what he was saying. Also, there was a preacher called the Reverend John Smith, who had been out on one of the plantations, and he'd set up a little church, and he'd started preaching to the enslaved. Now, that was something that had been prohibited by law, but it was sort of tolerated on certain plantations where, you know, the people thought, oh, well, if they become Christians, they might be less likely to get drunk and fight and this kind of thing, and they're more obedient to their masters. So they tolerated it, but it was officially not allowed. What was also not allowed was teaching them to read. John Smith was full-on missionary, ignored all that, taught them to read, ministered the gospel, you know, told them your brothers, and this was fermented, if you like, not just this sort of foundation of unrest, but also it gave them the ability to be able to read the newspapers in English and know the movements of the whites. So when they planned their operation, it was planned meticulously, and the whites were completely taken by surprise. So John Gladstone was blamed for that. He blamed the Reverend John Smith, who was a white missionary from the London Missionary Society. Yeah. John Gladstone then called for the death of John Smith, okay, and blamed Canning's amelioration measures, blamed everyone but himself. Well, he became public enemy number one to the West India planters, because it all started on his plantation. Black Jack Gladstone, who wore his name, was the guy leading the charge, and, you know, everybody lost money and no one was getting compensated for it. Same time, you've got Buxton and Wilberforce arguing for compensation for the enslaved. So what this did was it threw up a conversation in England that basically laid it bare that there was no way that a couple of thousand whites could hold these tens of thousands of blacks for much longer. Sooner or later, emancipation would have to happen. So now the argument was emancipation with compensation, right? So the planters are then thinking, well, how can we couldn't get compensation when we lost, you know, for this uprising. So, you know, we need to work out how to get that compensation for us. So they twisted Wilberforce, they twisted Buxton, they twisted Parliament, and they were trying to convince them to give them the money and not the enslaved. West India Committee was thinking this is never going to fly. They wouldn't go with it. So John Gladstone and Bailey, the other Scotsman, went off to Bristol and they formed a little cabal and they formed this little Demerara Association. Lasted for about 2-3 years. And they cooked up a scheme that could be sold to the West India Committee as the main lobby group for Parliament to get Parliament to agree to take the 15 million that was going to be earmarked for the enslaved and instead give the enslaved nothing and give all the 15 million to the enslavers for the loss of their labor. When they got it to a stage where they could sell it to the West India Committee, John Gladstone went back, pitched it to the West India Committee. They got on board with it. He chaired that committee. It was then used as a lobby group to Parliament. They got the 15 million changed from a loan to a grant. They got it upgraded from 15 million to 20 million, and then they got it switched from paying out to the enslaved upon emancipation to paying out to the enslavers upon emancipation. So this whole scheme, the architects behind the scheme, as we know it, were two prominent Scotsmen in Parliament. And then when the scheme was paid out, John Gladstone was the single largest recipient of that compensation. And when he died in 1851, his abolitionist son, William Ewart Gladstone, longest serving prime minister in British history, 4 terms in office, received his share of all of that wealth. And he was an abolitionist, and he's always lauded himself as an abolitionist. And people say, "Oh, his dad might have been a slave trader, but he was an abolitionist." He was advocating for abolition with compensation, so his father could be the biggest recipient. Because after they'd abolished it in 1833, they kept the enslaved in labor as apprentices for a further 4 years. And they took more or less low-paid labor from them for 4 years. So it's like, you're emancipated, but you can't leave the plantation. You're not property anymore. We're going to give you a little salary, some peanuts, but basically you're still working for us. The conditions remained almost the same. So they took the money and kept their labor for another 4 years. Then the apprenticeship system was abolished, at which point John Gladstone switched his shipping line to Calcutta and began the process of bringing indentured laborers from Calcutta and Shanghai into the Caribbean and the Americas, which were known, and it's a derogatory term, but they were known as Gladstone's coolies. And they populated the plantations. Now all the slaves had down tools, wouldn't cut the cane, crops were dying in the fields. Gladstone started shipping these guys in, en masse. And the person who organized the charter of the first Gladstone ship to go and do this was a man called Samuel Sandbach of the firm Sandbach, Tinney & Co. And that's what brings it into my realm. So that's how the slavery compensation scheme went down. And when people received their compensation, they converted it into bonds. And, some of them took the money, some of them converted it into bonds. And the people who converted it into bonds just took dividends off it and continued to receive them dividends until the last bond was redeemed against the exchequer on the West India account in 2015. So all of us taxpayers, including myself, were paying contributions towards reparations for enslavers for the loss of their slaves 170 years ago.
And you've been to the Treasury to have discussions with them
Well,
about...
I did an article with Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission and the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. And we did an article together with the Wall Street Journal. And I laid my allegations to the Wall Street Journal with my evidence against the Bank of England and also Barclays Bank. And my allegations were put to both entities, and neither of them responded to my allegations. So the allegations against the Bank of England were that they held that 20 million in the Bank of England in the West Indian accounts and some subsidiary accounts and some suspense accounts and escrow accounts. And when people made their claims, they would pay them out. But what happened was some of the claims took a long time to process. Some of them, people had died and estates were trying to claim it. Some of them, people died intestate. They went to probate. There was other cases where someone made a claim, but there was a counterclaim because they had an ex-business partner who was involved and had equity, or someone had a mortgage over the enslaved population, or someone had a mortgage over the estate. Because you could mortgage your slaves the way you mortgage your property, because enslaved people were considered as property. So all of these things had to be resolved in order for the payments to go. So while these contested claims were all going on, or these estates were being sought, and all this kind of protocols were being adhered to, all that money was sitting in escrow in the Bank of England. So the Bank of England applied to Parliament for an act of Parliament to invest that money in the markets and to take a dividend of 8% of the yield for the Bank of England itself. So the Bank of England not only held all that money in escrow for all that time, but invested that money for profit and took a share of that profit for itself and paid dividends to the bondholders from those profits as well. So the Bank of England profited immensely from it. So when they made their official claims, they said, oh, we weren't directly involved in slavery. We only had some plantations that were defaulted to us because someone defaulted on a debt. They owed us money. They secured their loans with the plantation. So we got them by default. It wasn't like we were out there actively trying to be in the game. No, this whole entire compensation scheme, there is no one who got compensated for enslavement at the end of that period that did not receive their money via the Bank of England. All that money was held there, and the Bank of England invested that money and profited from it. So that was the allegation made to the Wall Street Journal. The Bank of England, to date, have not answered that allegation. The other one was against Barclays Bank. So the firm that enslaved my ancestors in Demerara was called Sambach Tinney & Co., namesake of Samuel Sambach and Philip Frederick Tinney. Okay, Samuel Sambach was an Englishman, Philip Frederick Tinney was a Dutchman, and they had partners who were all Scottish, and their wives were all Scottish. Okay, so these guys had formed a bank in 1831, just prior to the Emancipation Act of 1833, and they had called it the Bank of Liverpool with the symbol of the liver bird. Okay, and the Bank of Liverpool was Britain's first ever joint stock bank. So one of the partners in it who had the major shareholding from the Sambach Tinney family, who was a shareholder in Sambach Tinney as well, was a guy called George Rainey, another Scotsman. They have a scholarship for George Rainey at Glasgow University to this day. And I believe from Stephen Mullen's report, when he did the report on the legacies of enslavement at University of Glasgow, that is worth about £500,000 a year by comparison, and it's in perpetuity. Okay, George Rainey was an obnoxious man. He was also very much implicated in the Highland clearances because he took some of his compensation money and purchased the island of Rassay. And he made a law, because now he's like the laird of the island or whatever, he made a law on the island that none of the poor croft farmers on the island could get married on his island. So if you want to get married, you had to leave his island. And there was other notes about, like, there was not a wife on the island that he hadn't slept with. I mean, he went as if he was on the plantation and they just took the slaves and they just did what they wanted. And when he came back to Scotland, he started behaving in just the same manner.
Yeah.
He was a ruthless man. But he's remembered at Glasgow University for the Rainey Scholarship, you know, and people get it. And it's, you know, for science and technology and whatever. And, you know, people are very proud to have it without really knowing anything about the man himself. So credit to Stephen Mullen for pulling that one out and putting it there. Without Stephen's report, I would never have known that there was even such a thing. But these are the partners in Sambach Tinney, and like George Rainey, of all the shareholders in the family, George Rainey had the largest share of the Bank of England, Britain's first joint stock bank. Now that bank went on to absorb a whole bunch of other slave banks, and a lot of the slave trading families had their own private banks, like Leyland and Bullens, like Arthur Haywood and Sons. These were all banks of enslavers. Sambach Tinney absorbed a bunch of them, okay? And then when they wanted clearing status, they bought an old London clearing bank in order to be able to get clearing status, which was called Martin's Bank. And Martin's Bank was founded in the 16th century by Sir Thomas Gresham. And he was the guy who convinced Queen Elizabeth I to stop borrowing money from Venetian moneylenders and to borrow money in Lombard Street in London. And his establishment of Martin's Bank on Lombard Street was the foundations of what today we call the City of London. Okay, the financial epicenter of Europe. So he founded that. His symbol was the cricket. Their symbol for Bank of Liverpool was the liver bird.
Mm.
So Samuel Sambach Tinney, they bought out through Bank of Liverpool, Martins Bank, and became Bank of Liverpool Martins Bank Limited. Bank of Liverpool Martins Bank Limited. So they had the cricket over the top and the liver bird underneath, and that was their joint symbol. So they traded, and I mean, they became the 6th largest bank in the UK. Between them and Martins Bank, they swallowed up collectively over 69 banks, to become the 6th largest bank in Britain. And they continued trading until Barclays bought them out in 1969. And when Barclays bought them out in 1969, my understanding is it represented 40% of Barclays' global portfolio. They had 3,000 employees, they had 600 branches, and their headquarters in Liverpool, the Martins Bank building, which is right next door to the town hall, it dwarfs the town hall, was Barclays' regional headquarters until 2007. Now, Barclays had been outed in America by a group of researchers over there in a Guardian article, I think it was in 2007, for their connections to enslavement. And they came out and said, oh, it's just, we had this Arthur and Haywood's and Sons. It was a very small part of our portfolio. And, we just got it by default. And it was, it wasn't much, and we're going to do diversity. That's what Barclays alleged. Arthur Haywood and Sons was one of the 69 slave banks that formed Bank of Liverpool. Barclays didn't buy Arthur Haywood and Sons. Bank of Liverpool bought Arthur Haywood and Sons. Barclays bought Bank of Liverpool.
Yeah.
So they were kind of getting out of it on the basis that the Americans hadn't made the connection with Bank of Liverpool. They were looking at Arthur Haywood and Sons in isolation. Yeah. So Barclays were trying to dumb it down and make it look like it was just this small little entity. What my research did was pull this together with a whole tree of banks that were involved in this, of which Arthur Haywood's was one small part of
and this Malik is all in the book.
This is all in the book, including the shareholders and what their shareholdings were for Bank of Liverpool. There's like a table in the book and who was at the helm of the bank. So Samuel Sambach was mayor of Liverpool 1831 to 1832. And William Brown was the first chairman of the Bank of Liverpool, namesake of William Brown Street. If anyone's been in Liverpool, they'll know St. George's Hall is there. You've got the Assize Courts. You've got the Walker Art Gallery. You've got the International Museum. All of these really civic buildings. You've got kind of Nelson.
I want to cover a lot of stuff tonight, if you don't mind. I want to ask a few general questions and then come back to the specifics of Demerara and the Scottish connection. But first of all, let me ask you that people often say when they read stories like your book, etc., they say, "Oh, but hold on a second, slaves go back thousands of years."
It wasn't us; it was the Romans. Or what about the Romans?
Well, they start off with the Greeks and the Sumerians and all the rest of it.
You know what? I'm planning to do a documentary one day called "What About the Romans," because what about the Romans is like the concept of what about the Romans is the gaslighting, par excellence of the far right. It's a way. It's like a woman comes into the police station and says, "I've been raped," and they say, "Yeah, sorry, we can't deal with you, love, because we've got a murder victim over here." Do you know what I mean? It's like that you can't make this equivalence. Okay. Slavery is so close to me in my family tree as to be almost within touching distance.
Yeah. I'm born in put up the family tree, please.
I'm born in 1966.
No, the family tree, Kevin. There we are.
So if you take the headers off, there we go. So I'm right at the bottom there, born in 1966. Okay. My father is Reginald Wilcox Watson. He's born in 1918. He is the son of George Edward Watson, who would have been born in the 1880s, there or thereabouts. Slavery was only abolished in Brazil in 1880. Therefore, my grandfather had slavery in living memory. My granddad Slavery was abolished in 1888 in Cuba. So 98, 08, 18, that's 30 years before my father was born.
Yeah. I mean, what people will see right away, of course, is the number of Scottish names up there.
I mean, so
you know,
yeah,
the Stuarts, the Robertsons,
yeah,
all the rest of it. Yeah.
there's a bit of a there's a kind of a timeline there as well. But if you go back to the family tree,
Yeah, go back, get that. Yeah.
So you can see here, you know, at the top of it, you've got the beginnings of this where it starts. So George Robertson, he's of the Robertsons of Kindacre. So these are the Clan Donachade who came out for the Bruce at Bannockburn, I think, and the Bruce asked one of them to name his son after him. So Clan Donachade became Robertson, son of Robert. Okay, but later they marry into the Bruce's clan. So there's a link there through the Douglases of Mulderg, Christian Douglas. Okay, so George Robertson is the guy who starts this. So he through the Robertsons and the Douglases has a genealogy which goes right back to the Bruce, and then through the Bruce it goes back to Joan Plantagenet, and through her it goes back to King Philip of France and Edward Longshanks. So this is like the history of Scotland is totally mixed in with these guys.
Yeah, and people will notice. People will notice down the bottom of the page, Andrew Watson.
Yes, well, we'll get to him. Well, that's because there's a timeline here. Charles Stewart Parker is apprentice to George Robertson, and Samuel Sandbach is apprentice to George Robertson. So George Robertson, born in 1756, dies in 1799. In 1780, a very young Charles Stewart, 1790, sorry, a very young sort of 19-year-old Charles Stewart Parker heads out to Grenada from Glasgow because his uncle, who's also known as Charles Parker, has made a fortune out there and has plantations. So he realizes that there's a fortune to be made in slavery in Grenada. So he goes out to Grenada, but by this time, his uncle is an absentee planter, and he's trying to find a house to join, what they call a house, which is a merchant trading house. And he can't find one. So he sees an advert in the paper by George Robertson advertising for a business partner, but you need £1,000 investment. So he goes to his father, who is known as Captain James Parker. He's not on this list. Captain James Parker is in Virginia. And you know, anyone who knows anything about Glasgow knows about the tobacco lords and knows that Virginia was the epicenter of that. Charles Stewart Parker's father is right there. Charles Stewart Parker himself, although he's a Scot, he's actually born in Virginia. So his father's out there, and his father has a really close friend who's also a distant cousin named Charles Stewart. And he named his son Charles Stewart Parker after his friend. Okay? And Charles Stewart had an enslaved man called Somerset. And Somerset is really important in this whole story because Somerset came to England on his master's behalf. He was highly educated. He used to dress him in silks. He did these kind of diplomatic missions because Charles Stewart was the paymaster general for the crown. He was the last paymaster general for the crown, collecting taxes for the king from the colonists in America before the American War of Independence. So he sent his slave to England on a mission. While his slave was over in England, he got with the abolitionists. And while he was with the abolitionists, they said, if we baptize you, you won't be property anymore because you can't baptize property. You'll be a person. And when you're a person, you can't be a slave. So because you can't own, you can't, property and people is two different things in law. So you can't baptize property, you can only baptize a person. So they baptized him and called him James. So he became, from Somerset, he became James Somerset. He then went AWOL. Charles Stewart put out an APB for him, demanded if anyone catches him, they put him on a ship and ship him out to Jamaica. He was caught and he was put on a ship. The abolitionists found out and they came and filed a writ of habeas corpus. And that writ of habeas corpus was elevated up to the Lord Chief Justice, which was Lord Mansfield. Mansfield heard the case and ruled on the case that having looked at all the statute books in England at the time, he could not find a single law that allowed you, this is 1763, that allowed you to enslave a man in England. And the argument that he was property was null and void because he'd been baptized. So that narrow ruling set off a chain of events that was seismic and catastrophic for the Americans, because who was in the audience when this case was being heard was actually Benjamin Franklin, who then thought Mansfield has made a ruling and England has freed the slaves, because Somerset was told to be released. It was like, there's no law in England to enslave him, and if you send him back to the Caribbean, he's going to be enslaved. So you can't send him into slavery. There's no law in England that permits you to do that. Release him. So he was released. So people believed then, oh, that means that they've released the slaves. So Benjamin Franklin goes back and raises the militias and informs all the colonists. And that's how one of the major triggers of the American War of Independence. Now, we always think the Boston Tea Party and all that kind of stuff, and it was to do with the whole, taxes from King George and all of that kind of stuff. And it was all of those things. But this played a significant part in Franklin's thinking. Now, what did Franklin do? When the colonists came and attacked Virginia, the Brits, Charles Stewart Parker's dad, had a major property there. They attacked his house and burnt it down. He joined the Loyalists and fought against Benjamin Franklin and the colonists. He was captured, he escaped, he was recaptured, he was shipped off to France. Then the French Revolution happened, he was released, and then basically he set up shop in London. And then his son goes out to Grenada, and he's now got all these really high-level contacts out there. He knows the slavery business inside out. He's been, living in Virginia for God knows how long. And he decides to invest in his son's business and to help his son get this business off the ground. To give you an example how much money these Scotsmen made, when Charles Stewart Parker put his £1,000 investment with George Robertson as a 19-year-old kid, and that investment, he was told, you have to do an apprenticeship to learn slavery before you can become a full partner. He did his apprenticeship. So this is 1792. By 1799, 7 years later, when George Robertson died, he left £250,000 on day of death in 1799. That's billions in today's money. And the financial accounts for the year before, which I've seen from 1798, they're 50-50 partners, Charles Stewart Parker and George Robertson. And Charles Stewart Parker receives £105,000 dividend that year. So this is massive amounts of money. He's made himself from £1,000 7 years before. He's now got £105,000 in 1 year. 7 years later. Samuel Sandbach come in as an apprentice at the same time. And what then happened was, before George Robertson died, Charles Stewart Parker married his niece, Margaret Rainey. Then, after he died, Samuel Sandbach married his other niece, Elizabeth Robertson. Elizabeth Robertson was known as one of the 3 fair maids of Kiltern, and she was born to the Reverend Harry Robertson, Doctor of Divinity at the Manse of Kiltern. So the Manse of Kiltern was attached to the church there. Harry Robertson was a senior clergyman, Doctor of Divinity, and he was receiving money from the slave enterprise that became Sandbach's Tinny, and he was receiving regular amounts of money. Not only was he receiving income from them, but his daughter, having married one of them, because she married Samuel Sandbach, is now a beneficiary in the fullest sense of the word. Because Samuel Sandbach came in as a partner into the firm and then ended up becoming the namesake of the firm and became the main guy. So Charles Stewart Parker ran the operation from Glasgow, building the ships, providing the insurance through Caledonia Insurance to underwrite the cargoes, and building the ships on the Clyde. And then Samuel Sandbach ran the operation in Liverpool, which was receiving the merchandise that was coming in from the colonies, the sugar, the molasses, the coffee, the rum, the indigo, the timbers, and
Yeah.
so on. And he was the main broker in Liverpool at the Corn Exchange, at the Cotton Exchange, at Exchange Flags. They were selling the merchandise there. And the person who was running their operation from 1822 onwards in Demerara was a man called Peter Miller Watson. Now, Peter Miller Watson is another generation down. And the relationship, to understand Peter Miller Watson's role in it, you have to understand this tree. So Margaret Rainey is a cousin of Elizabeth Robertson. They are both nieces of the founder, George Robertson, and they're both married to the firm's partners, Charles Stewart Parker and Samuel Sambach, right? So they're all family. Now, Elizabeth's sister, there are 3 fair maids of Kilturn. So Elizabeth is the first. The second is Christian Robertson, okay? She married James Watson. James Watson was the Chamberlain, also at one point the factor, as in the debt collector, for Henry Dundas of Orkney, biggest landowner in Orkney, okay? And James Watson was operating out of Kirkwall. Now, he died quite young. He was only 38 years old when he died, but he had 5 children with Christian before he died, one of whom was Peter Miller Watson. And Peter, born in 1805, by 1822, he is already in Demerara managing the estates of Samuel Sambach and Charles Stewart Parker in Demerara. And these are vast estates of literally hundreds and hundreds of acres on each estate with thousands of enslaved people. And Peter Miller Watson has 2 plantations of his own with at least 500 enslaved people on that too. Okay? So these are major players there. And what Samuel Sambach and Charles Stewart Parker have also done, as did George Robertson before them, is they built a fleet of ships. So people who had plantations but didn't have ships would need to have passage for their cargo. So they would book them onto Samuel Sambach or George Robertson's or Charles Stewart Parker's ships, okay? And Peter Miller Watson would be responsible for going across all the plantations in Demerara, seeing who had what, and filling the holds of those ships with this cargo and accounting for everything, issuing the bills of lading, and then writing to Samuel Sambach, writing to Charles Stewart Parker, letting them know what's on board, what time it sailed, when it's going on. He just managed the whole entire operation. He was the man in Demerara. Charles Stewart Parker was the man in Glasgow. Samuel Sambach was the man in Liverpool. And this tripartite arrangement worked like a major multinational conglomerate. And they got so rich off it, they were described as the Rothschilds of Demerara.
Amazing. And Andrew Watson, whose name will ring a bell with lots of Scots, because Andrew Watson became the first black captain of a national soccer team.
Yeah. So Andrew Watson was my entry point into this, because in 2003, Brendan O'Hara, I think he's a city councillor now, used to be a producer for the BBC, and Stuart Cosgrove, who was a football pundit, was the former director of Channel 4. They made a film for BBC Scotland called Scotland's Lost Captain, and they had discovered through the research of Jed O'Brien, who's the founder of the Scottish Football Museum.
He's a friend of the show.
Yeah, Jed O'Brien had discovered a black footballer who had predated the guy they thought was the first black footballer, Arthur Wharton. Arthur Wharton had played for Preston North End at the turn of the 20th century. And they had discovered, Jed had discovered when he was going through the Queen's Park photographs, the ones that were uncatalogued, he discovered this black guy in Queen's Park, and he's like, hang on, this can't be right. And then he looked through more and, Scottish football annuals and so on, and he found this guy in not just Queen's Park, he found him also in the Scottish national team. So Jed's research was really the foundation of this whole epic saga for me, because I would never have looked into this had it not been for Jed discovering Andrew Watson.
Yeah, Andrew Watson was the first black captain of any national football team.
Well, I mean, Jed
That's
knows
what
the
Jed,
details
that's what
about
Jed
this.
has told us.
I focus on whatever Jed has told you on this. That is absolutely
Yeah.
the case.
And
There's no one who knows more about Andrew Watson than Jed O'Connor.
and your father was a Watson, so you guys are connected in some way.
So this is why I was trying to work out whether we connected. And it's not just the fact that my father was a Watson. It was also the fact that there were pictures of Andrew Watson. There were photographs of him. He's born in 1856. He died in 1921. They had photographs of him. And he looked just like me. Like it was like looking in the mirror. And that was scary. And I'd seen this BBC documentary, and I'm looking at this guy. He's got the same family name as my father, same family name as my grandfather, comes from the same place in Demerara, looks like me. I'm thinking, you know, if it quacks, it's a duck, you know? There's got to be a connection. I just need to find out what that connection is. And that is really what started me on the journey. And this book, Searching for My Slave Roots, is actually me trying to find the connection through all of this grand history to Andrew Watson.
Fascinating. I mean, it's interesting too. I mean, while you were speaking, I was reminded of I watched a Tory politician taking her seat, and she was making her maiden speech, and she was explaining that where she came from, and she said, "I'm proud to tell you that this is the place where the Scottish prisoners from the Battle of Dunbar, which they lost to Cromwell, were shipped as slaves to the West Indies, and this was in 1650." She took enormous pride in this, which is some indicator of itself. But it does suggest that slavery was so endemic that it cut across racial barriers as well. Is that the case?
Not really. No. There's lots of sort of pseudo narratives about white slaves and Irish slaves and so on. And I think what people did was they conflated issues around indentureship, and they conflated issues around prison transport and so on. It's like, for instance, now people conflate transatlantic slavery with modern slavery. So modern slavery, someone gets trafficked, for whatever reason, trying to get somewhere, and they end up working in a hotel, or they end up in the sex trade or something like that, and they equate that to transatlantic slavery. It has a lot of the hallmarks in its principle, but the industrial scale and the legal framework within which transatlantic enslavement occurred does not permeate for modern slavery. There's no law in Parliament to say that you can traffic someone in a container from China and bring them over here and make them work for peanuts in a hotel or on picking strawberries. There's no law to let people do that. It's a criminal activity. People do that. It's a whole total criminal enterprise. Transatlantic slavery was fully legal. It was endorsed by Parliament. There was acts of Parliament. It was passed by the House of Lords. There was bills after bills after bills. It was, people were open about it. Cases were heard. People were captured, enslaved people were captured. Instead of being freed, oh my God, we've got this person who's been enslaved, let's set them free. It was like, no, send him back to his master, whip him, chop his foot off. It was, can you imagine, like, if you got a Chinaman ran away from a people trafficker here, ran to the police, and the police took him back to the trafficker and said, cuts his foot off. You can't equate one to the other. They're trying to conflate these things is disingenuous. There is a very distinct nature to each of these different crimes against humanity.
I think what
you need to do is you need to look at them as individual ethics.
I think that's an important point, Malik. But in fairness to a lot of people, they rely very much upon history books for their understanding of how things were.
Yeah, but the history books are often wrong. I mean, I looked at the history books, and my research is turning them inside out.
Oh, of course. I despair sometimes when I look at the history books that I consumed when I was a school child.
Yeah, some of them are just pure propaganda.
Well,
imagine if there was a history book compiled today for people in 200 years' time, and the sole source of that history was the Sun newspaper.
Yeah.
Or Fox News. And people were like, yeah, that's what it was like in the 2000s.
Yeah.
It's just, the perspective of life is so much more nuanced. You have to have multiple perspectives, but in order to have multiple perspectives, you've got to think, who controls the narrative? Who has the ability to have a voice? The enslaved people, from the moment they got on that ship, were forbidden to read and write, were forbidden to speak their own language, had no life of their own, could not go anywhere without a pass from their master. Their life and death was in the hands of a third-party individual who could have them killed at a moment's notice with no consequence. The guy who owned the slave ship Zong threw 130-something people over the side and then tried to claim insurance on them. When the case was brought up before the same guy, Mansfield, who had the Somerset case, and Mansfield looked at this, and the first thing that came up in the argument was, it's not a case of murder of 130-something people. They're his property. He has the right to do with his property what he wants. It would be no different if he threw 130 planks of wood over the side. He can dispose of his property how he chooses. The question in law for them was, is he entitled to claim insurance? And he was the one who actually did that. They didn't just die. They were sick and there was a shortage of water. So he had to make a decision. So he took all the sick ones and threw them overboard. So he wasn't charged with murder. He wasn't charged with killing those people. So this is like, you've got to think about it in the sense there was a whole framework that existed, a legal and a social framework that existed that facilitated and permitted all of these heinous acts.
Yeah.
And that is not common in the kind of stuff that we see today. All the stuff that you're mentioning, there's the stuff of the Irish, when the Irish were indentured and sent out, and then the prison penal colonies when people were, steal a loaf of bread and get sentenced to hard labor, in Australia or Tasmania or whatever. These are different things. These people could find their way out of that. Their children were not automatically indentured. If you were enslaved and you had a child, your child was enslaved. Your child was property of the person who owned you. And the history. If you control the narrative, you can say from a colonial point of view what history is. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to pick apart the archives to retell the history based on the factual evidence that's there, not the rhetoric of the time.
Yeah. Do you know Sir Geoffrey Palmer? Did you come across Sir Geoffrey in your...
Cross paths with Sir Jeff Palmer. He passed away recently.
Yeah.
I didn't know him personally. I didn't know him well. He was one of the people who was in the original Andrew Watson documentary.
Yeah.
And in many ways, with no disrespect meant to Sir Jeff, he was asked to present a sort of a narrative as to what was the likely nature of the relationships between Peter Miller Watson and Anna Rose, the mother of Andrew Watson. And he presented a kind of very sort of typical narrative, which actually is factually incorrect. And that was one of the things that we had to check on. But to be fair to Jeff, rest his soul, he was giving a narrative based on the sort of conjecture, if you like, where the BBC were trying to really just fill in blanks. They had a very strong sense of the football history of Andrew Watson, but they didn't know much about the family. I've spent 20 years delving deep into this family. And I am to the family what Jed O'Brien is to the football.
Yeah.
I mean, Jed has an absolute expertise in the football. I never step into the football realm. Yeah. I default to Jed O'Brien because I know he's the absolute expert in that. Yeah. And Jed's the same thing. We have this mutual respect. Jed will say, if it's a family thing, talk to Malik, because he knows that I've spent the same amount of time looking into the family as he has looking into the football. And unfortunately, what Sir Jeff did say in the first Andrew Watson documentary turned out to be factually incorrect.
Okay. This has been absolutely fascinating. I wanted to just ask you to speculate, because we've only got 5 or 6 minutes left, about what you see happening across the UK in terms of the rise of the far right. What is your assessment of how this is all going to work out?
Well, I've been dealing with the far right my whole entire life. My earliest childhood memories of being chased by the National Front when I was 8 years old. A bunch of grown men chased me across a farmer's field, grabbed me and threw me in a river. I was 8 years old. So this is not new to me. I've been dealing with this forever. it's new to so-called mainstream because, you know, if these things don't affect you, you wouldn't have reason or cause to think about them. For me, they've affected me for the whole of my life. So I've always had to think about them. So
Yeah.
none of this is new to me, you know.
So what advice would you give people?
Well, I think, you know, the first aspect of reparations is stop being racist, you know, because the whole idea of racial hierarchies was constructed in institutes of knowledge production. And those institutes of knowledge production, whether they were schools curriculum, colleges, universities, many of them were founded by enslavers with money. I'll give you an example. The Liverpool Royal Institution was founded by Thomas Stuart Trail. He's of the trails of Kirkwall in Orkney. And Thomas Stuart Trail was the second husband of Christian Robertson. When Peter Miller Watson's father, James Watson, died, she married Thomas Stuart Trail, had another 5 children with him. He wrote the curriculum for the Royal Institution, which became the foundation of what we today would call the national curriculum. So, you know, and he was fully endowed by Christian, who received all her money from her uncle, George Robertson, the slave trader who left £250,000 on his day of death. So the Royal Institution, which was co-founded by Trail and Roscoe, William Roscoe, went on to become the Mechanics Institute, Liverpool Mechanics Institute, which is today John Moores University, Liverpool School of Arts, which is also, and the Mechanics Institute, which collectively also became Liverpool University. So you've got John Moores University, Liverpool University, both born out of Sandbach's Tinney family. And then you've got the Manchester Mechanics Institute, became UMIST, which is now part of University of Manchester. And then there's a bunch of schools in Liverpool, like LIPA, Liverpool Institute of Performing Arts, was Liverpool School of Arts, which was founded by these guys. The Collegiate was founded by these guys. Liverpool College, a private school, founded by these guys. The Blue Coat, which is still the best school in Liverpool. It's no longer private, it's academy, but, you know, it wasn't founded by these guys. It was founded 100 years before then, but these guys came in and became among the governing body of that. Yeah. And these guys were forming these institutes of knowledge production. They were carrying these professors out there on their slave ships to go and examine botany and all these medicine, tropical medicine, and these things. And they were plying them with females on board the ship, and then they were bringing them back, and they were giving them money and endowments for these universities so that they could produce this pseudoscience, this false narrative that Black people were closer in the evolutionary chain to monkeys than men, and that in Darwinian theory that they went on the boat with Noah, that they evolved as a separate subspecies, they got smaller heads with lesser brains and more infantile, and, you know, all this kind of nonsense, complete and utter nonsense. But that was the foundation of much of the sciences, these institutions, which underpinned the idea of white supremacy and racial hierarchies. People don't know that history. Black people don't know it. They don't know how they came to be the subject of racism. White people don't know it. They don't know where their privilege came from. And they also don't know why these narratives were constructed. So for me, the principal thing is I focus on education. I ignore all the waffle. Yeah. If someone's going to come up to me and hit me in the street or throw something at me or do something to me, I'll deal with that in the street. But, you know, until that day comes, you know, I will continue to try and learn. I will continue to try and educate people. And the more people get educated to it, the more they can unpick the racism inherently within themselves. And then once they do that, hopefully these kind of things will find no fertile soil.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that will be the case. I mean, really, Malik, this has been absolutely fascinating. I so much appreciate you joining us tonight. I hope people will go out and buy your book, Searching for My Slave Roots.
Yeah, and I'm going to be in Scotland as well very shortly. Yeah, so I'm doing an event with the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh on the 2nd of October. So if you Google that, it's part of their Black History Month program. And I'm going to be in Glasgow on the 30th of September at Waterstones in Glasgow. I'm doing that with a fantastic author called Miranda Kaufman, who's just done this book called Heiresses, about women who inherited fortunes from enslavers. And she and I are going to be in conversation at Waterstones in Glasgow. So I think it's Argyle Street.
Yeah, it is.
And on the 1st of October, we're going to be at the Portobello bookshop in Edinburgh. That'll just be me. And I'll be doing a book talk in each of these places. So the Waterstones in Glasgow will be in conversation with Miranda Kaufman in the National Library of Scotland on the 2nd, and the Portobello Bookshop in Edinburgh on the 1st. We'll be talking about this book.
Excellent. There you are, folks. That's 3 dates for your diary. If you can get to at least one of those, because you'll find it absolutely fascinating. We've only got an hour, and we've tried to cover as much as we can in that short space of time. But I hope you'll agree with me, it was well worth your hour, as I promised you at the beginning. A big thank you to you, Malik. Every success with the book. And hopefully you can come back sometime and tell us more about how things are developing and what your views are.
Hopefully I'll see you guys.
Thank you. And thank you to you, everyone, for watching us. Let me just remind you that we have Professor Alf Baird next week talking about the UN initiative about colonization. So if you're interested in that, please join us next week at 7 o'clock. In the meantime, let me say thank you again to Malik, and to say to all of you out there watching and listening, stay safe, take care, look after each other. Good night.
Good night.